Well, thank you very much to everyone who's here tonight. I'm Sandra Toes, the director of the School of Information Management, and I'm very excited to have to open this lecture tonight. So with our Information Management Public Lecture Series, what we try and do is really convince the world that information management is the center of everything, which is absolutely true. But what we try and do in reality is show how it connects to almost all of the major topics and themes that are going on in the world around us. So tonight we're very excited to have two speakers. So I'm going to make sure that they have enough time to talk. So I'm now going to ask Jay to come up and introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Sandra. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. Welcome to a very interesting installment in the Information Management Public Lecture Series. And as Sandra said, today we're lucky to have two speakers, both graduates from the Masters of Marine Management program here at Dalhousie, who I will fully introduce in a moment after setting the stage. Scientists have been communicators for as long as there's been discoveries to communicate. Today, scientific research can be instrumental in helping to solve major policy issues locally, nationally, and globally. Seeking solutions to these issues is the responsibility of everyone. As we know, the public servants, politicians, and researchers. Therefore, communication about research is essential. But how well is this communication working? In this lecture, both Alex Desiré-Tesar and Curtis Martin will speak about their recent studies that investigated scientific communication, both from the perspective of scientists and the environmental NGOs which engage the public in discussions, through to the use of engagement with social media platforms. So our first presenter is going to be Alexander Desiré-Tesar. Alex is originally hailing from Yellowknife and then moved to one of my favorite cities, Ottawa, in his youth, and then came to Halifax to attend King's College. In his valedictory address from King's, Alex defended the value, I think, of a liberal arts education and pointed out a truism between the tension between the workaday world and academic pursuits, something I've had the opportunity to see both sides of. Saying in his address that our task, our gift, is thinking and reflecting, which is nearly impossible if you're working too hard. So I think that's an excellent observation. As a former political staffer, I can guarantee that there's a lot of hard work going on in Ottawa. Thank you for the two people who got that. After graduation, Alex worked as a journalist with an internship at Latham's Quarterly and then an editor with The Walrus. As a journalist, his interest was on science communication and the oceans, which became the focus of his graduate research for his Master of Marine Management here at Dalhousie. So please join me in welcoming Alex Desiré-Tesar.
Hi everyone, as Jay said, my name is Alex, and welcome. Thanks for coming tonight. So just to give you a quick outline of the presentation, we're going to open up with a philosophical question. Then we're going to look at kind of the broader management problem, some of the methods I use to conduct my research, the results, recommendations, and finally some acknowledgements. So as promised, let's open up with a philosophical question. Why are we here? What's the point of this? I'm referring to this current moment of us all in a room together as you listen to me speak in front of my extremely well-made PowerPoint presentation. But also more abstractly, what's the point of having a formal gathering at which one presents research to a group of like-minded people with potentially similar interests or backgrounds? Are we here out of a sense of duty or obligation? Are we facilitating the transfer and mobilization of knowledge? And if so, what are we planning to do with it? So these aren't just the musings of someone at school on a Monday night. This is also a pertinent set of issues facing science and management communities. The science policy and science media interfaces are changing, and specifically there are three kind of interrelated changes occurring. First, there's a growing interest in decentralizing management and increasing public participation, especially in the management of the marine space. So in the US, for example, we have regional ocean plans that are being created with the participation of local stakeholders and indigenous groups. And here in Canada, there's a greater acknowledgement that coastal communities need to be included in marine spatial planning. At the same time, we're seeing a decline of trust in authorities and experts. So this has manifested itself in larger conversations about fake news and the responsibilities of journalists and other experts, but also issues much closer to home. So in the Bay of Fundy, for example, we have fishermen who are pushing back against the scientific consensus on the potential safety of tidal turbines in the area. There's also been controversy that you may have heard of about the safety of storing natural gas near the Shubenacadie River. And both of these cases additionally involve contests about the validity of other forms of knowledge besides science when it comes to decision making. Finally, the media environment itself has been changing, largely driven by technology. So the gatekeeping function of journalism has diminished, with newspapers and other organizations shedding both science journalists and local coverage. So one result of these trends is that scientists have really stepped up their role as communicators and public figures, and this leads to questions about what that should look like in practice. Historically, scientists have adopted a deficit model of communication. So this model, we have scientists producing knowledge and deciding what the public needs to know, and then packaging that for public consumption. Unfortunately, this has not really led to either increased science literacy or increased public support for science, and in some cases has actually diminished support for science. So instead, what some communication scholars have advocated for is a dialogue model. In this model, we have a two-way exchange of information between scientists and the public. And ideally, this arrangement increases trust, but also increases the quality and relevance of the research. So the questions I wanted to ask are, what are the factors that are encouraging or discouraging ocean and aquatic scientists from communicating the results with the public? And whether these are similar to those identified of surveys of scientists from other countries, whether scientists regard scientific literacy as a precondition for public engagement with science and management, and what are the preferred methods of engagement? So are they using traditional media like newspapers or magazines? Are they doing interviews? Or have they transitioned to social media? Are they trying to use new methods and technologies to get their message to the world? So to answer these questions, I first did a review of the literature around public engagement with science to find some reoccurring themes. And so these ended up being perceptions of the public. So for example, how competent is the public? Perceptions of the media, scientists' own communications objectives, their level of communications training and experience, so whether or not they'd gone to school or attended workshops, and finally, their ability to balance communications and outreach with their other work. I then conducted an online survey and follow-up interviews that addressed these themes. And my participants were drawn from the Ocean Tracking Network, which is where I did my internship this past summer. OTN is headquartered here at Dalhousie, but they work with researchers around the world. And specifically, their goal is to combine oceanographic data with information about the movements and survival of aquatic animals, and to help inform management. So they were really an ideal partner for my research. In total, 392 researchers were contacted, and 82 responded, which was a 21% response rate. 5 of these were then selected for follow-up interviews. 2 students, 1 mid-career researcher, and 2 senior researchers. And these were chosen based on a combination of their responses, demographic information, and their current and previous work, which ranged from government to industry to academia. Their interviews were coded according to the themes established earlier. So, what did we learn? First, the participants of my study were engaging frequently with both the media and the public. 50% had had more than 6 professional interactions with journalists within the past 3 years. At the same time, most had little or no formal communications training. Those who did typically received it at work or while attending a workshop at a conference. About half said more training would make them more likely to communicate, while a third said it wouldn't. In the interview, scientists were more interested in training that would prepare them for interactions with journalists, so things like helping them understand what interviews will be, rather than with members of the public. So the survey and interview results suggest that many scientists learn by doing or through informal peer networks when it comes to communications. So while I didn't look at how effective individual researchers were, the literature suggests that the status quo isn't really working. And in the words of one of my respondents, I think most of my colleagues think that they are good communicators with non-scientists, but aren't. One surprising result was in the area of time management. So in the literature, there's a lot of conversation about the amount of time available for communications and outreach, and this is often cited as a reason why scientists aren't communicating with the public. But I found the majority of my respondents felt that they did have time, or at any rate were able to make time. So this was a common theme among the people who responded to me. And it suggests that scientists are making communications more of a priority in their day-to-day work. In terms of their relationships with the media, respondents said that their interactions had been largely positive, which is in line with previous research. This held across a variety of traditional mediums, including newspaper, radio, magazines, and TV. They were less generous when it came to journalists' ability to communicate science relative to scientists themselves. Many contrasted the two. So while scientists were more accurate and more likely to get the facts right, journalists are able to convey the information in a more compelling and accessible way. In interviews, some respondents hinted at a sometimes adversarial relationship between the two. So a journalist might ask hard questions or subtly direct you to make a response that maybe lacks some of the nuance or subtlety. The importance of staying on message during interviews and obtaining training in order to do that was repeatedly emphasized by scientists. Interestingly, however, two of the researchers who'd had formal communications training talked about how helpful it was to simply understand how and why journalists do the things that they do. So that kind of journalistic cultural independence, but also just stuff like when they hold their meetings and a sort of deadline-oriented work environment. So to move to the topic of social media, Curtis is going to give you a full rundown of some of these topics and what scientists are doing. But I did ask them about their social media use. And of course, it can provide an opportunity for scientists to bypass journalists and communicate directly with the public. Given some researchers' low opinions of journalists' science communication skills, I expected this to be a more popular tool. However, comparatively few of my respondents actually used social media in this way. In interviews, it was suggested that there wasn't enough space on social media to convey nuance, and that packaging science for public consumption in this manner could lead to the spread of misinformation. One researcher likened it to talking into a void. So they felt more comfortable speaking to an interlocutor, even if that person was a journalist. One of my main questions was the extent to which researchers had internalized the importance of engaging with the public, as I mentioned earlier. And this produced what I think is a rather interesting result. Almost everyone, 91%, either agreed or strongly agreed that scientists should engage in dialogue with the public. But further questions kind of complicated this picture. For example, opinion was much more closely divided on whether the public understands enough about science to engage meaningfully with scientists themselves. And so obviously it's difficult to create a two-way conversation if the sides aren't speaking the same language. Opinion was also split on whether members of the public who did not understand the relevant science should be allowed to participate in management decisions. So some felt participation was a democratic right. Others thought the bar should be set higher. Overall, it suggests that a number of respondents had a negative perception of the public's competence. This also carried over into what they felt the public was interested in when it came to science communication. So do we have to talk down to the public? Do we need to describe it in a way that the public can understand? Do we need to include a shark in order to grab people's attention? In interviews, however, participants talked about their real-life interactions with the public, which were almost always positive. And these interactions covered a wide range of activities and groups, from presentations at schools to stakeholder consultation. And in most situations they described, the public was interested and in some cases quite knowledgeable. So what's going on? Well, although we often talk about engaging with the public as a catch-all term, we're really describing not only diverse methods of engagement, but also multiple publics. Previous research suggests that scientists construct a kind of imaginary or rhetorical lay public in their head when they think about communication in the abstract, rather than the real and sometimes competent people they've actually interacted with. And so communication scholars argue that it's better to think of the public more dynamically, as a group that convenes around an area or topic of interest and develops knowledge and opinions. So the really useful work in the future will be understanding how this functions in practice. So who are the publics and how are scientists engaging with them? One possible case study would be the conflict in the Bay of Fundy that I mentioned earlier, or the Alton gas storage facility. Using an action research framework, communications experts could actually work with scientists to develop and identify effective strategies. Of course, we also need to clarify what is meant by an effective strategy. Some of my participants spoke about the importance of getting people on side. So they wanted training so that they would be able to convey or pitch their message more accurately and get more people on side to their way of thinking. So more training would likely lead to more engagement, and to that extent it's positive. However, it doesn't really address this absence of dialogue and the concomitant lack of trust that occurs. So fixing this issue requires more than a workshop. There needs to be a cultural shift that teaches and understands science communication not only as a practice, but also as a theory. It needs to look at science critically and encourage introspection about its goals. I therefore recommend, as part of my research, that science communication become a part of post-secondary science education, similar to the way that ethics and other humanities courses are taught in medical school. So while communications courses are often available to science students, my research suggested these were not always taken advantage of and tended to focus on skills such as doing interviews or going through the message box. A mandatory course in a university setting can bring in other disciplines and encourage a more critical discourse about the role science plays in society and decision-making, which will ideally result in more dialogue-based engagement rather than new and improved versions of condescending or paternalistic approaches. I should note that I'm not trying to denigrate the good work scientists are doing, often without training and for little or no benefit to themselves. But effectively addressing the relationship between science and the public will require a shift in how we, speaking as a researcher, former marine management student, and member of the public, conceptualize this relationship. An interdisciplinary approach is, I believe, the best way to do this. At the same time, it's important not to underestimate the challenges to doing so. We sometimes talk about interdisciplinarity in academia as though it were easy or straightforward or uncontroversial. Done properly, it is none of these things. It will be challenging and there will be conflict. But that messiness is something we should embrace. Progress, in my opinion, requires some experimentation. So I'd just like to close with the immortal words of Miss Frizzle, one of my personal science heroes. It's time to take chances, make mistakes, and get messy. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the Ocean Academy Network and everyone who's helped me. And I'll bring back Jay to talk about Curtis. Thank you.
Talk about Curtis, but also we'll do questions for both of you at the very, very end.
Yeah.
Okay. And while Dr. McDonald works his technical magic, you already done? I was about to say, should I talk fast or slow? Apparently, very, very fast. Okay. Our second speaker tonight is Curtis Martin. Curtis recently completed his Master's of Marine Management program here at Dalhousie University. Originally from Cranbrook, he attended the University of Victoria, where he moved from an emphasis on natural sciences and oceanography during his BSc to embrace an interdisciplinary interest in the research in his marine management and science communications. Curtis completed 2 internships during his studies for the Master of Marine Management, one with the Environmental Information Use and Influence Research Program, the EIUI, under the supervision of our own Dr. Bertram McDonald, and the second with the MEOPAR network, that is, the Marine Environmental Observation, Prediction, and Response Network. Curtis is now focused on promoting innovative and effective approaches to science communication with the public, in part motivated by the results of his research, his graduate research, which explored, as Alex said, science communication through social media. So if you'd come forward, Curtis, I'll give you the platform.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for being here today. So yes, my name is Curtis, and like Alex, I recently finished the Master of Marine Management program, and today I'm going to share with you my research, which is titled, "It Feels Like Engaging with a Friend, Using Interpersonal Communication Strategies to Encourage Science Conversations with Lay Audiences on Social Media." So just to get started, here is the outline of what I'm going to talk about today. So we'll start with the study context and the management problem which motivated my research. Then I'll go through the methodology that I used to tackle my research question. I'll share some selected results and then end off with some management recommendations which came out of my research. So diving right into the study context, as we all know, humans are negatively impacting the marine environment in a variety of ways through our activities. Now, many of these issues play out at what's known as the science policy interface. And this is where researchers and decision makers interact. Now, interestingly, and as Alex mentioned earlier, citizens are increasingly being expected to participate in decision-making processes. So this is bringing the public and citizens into this interface where decision makers and researchers are already interacting. Now, importantly, most citizens obtain most of their information online today, and this includes information that they need to participate in decision-making processes. Now, in one sense, this is really great, because the internet and social media facilitate two-way conversations. And again, as Alex mentioned, previously we had thought of our science communication model as this knowledge deficit, where basically all we needed to do was provide the public with the necessary information, and then we'd solve all the problems. But of course we know that this isn't the case, and it's now thought that effective science communication requires this two-way information exchange. Now the problem is, and my management problem is, that research communicators often struggle to reach lay audiences online. So in other words, a lot of times science communicators are communicating with other scientists or people already familiar with the information. And so this led me to my research question, which is, do particular social media strategies encourage two-way conversations between science communicators and lay audiences online? And kind of the motivation here is that if there are particular strategies that are effective for encouraging these conversations, then they can be implemented by a variety of science communicators for more effective science communication with the public. Okay, so how did I do this? Well, my study was based on a comparison of the Twitter and Instagram activity of two communicator groups. The first group was made up of 4 individual science communicators using their own personal social media accounts to share research. 2 of these were located in North America and 2 were located in Europe. The other group was made up of 3 environmental non-governmental organizations using organization accounts to share marine research and policy information online. One of these was local, one was national, and one was international. So I got ethics approval for this study, and because it was a relatively small sample size, all of the participants were treated anonymously. So I used a mixed methods approach to tackle my research question and tackle this comparison. And there were 2 main things I was focused on. The social media strategies being used by the science communicators, and the level of audience engagement on their social media posts. And engagement here was mainly focused on comments and conversations. And so I completed this in 4 main steps. The first thing I did was collected 1 month's worth of Twitter and Instagram data from all of the 7 communicator accounts. So this included Twitter posts, and Instagram stories, as well as all the Twitter comments and Instagram comments on the posts. And so this helped me determine what social media strategies are being used by the 7 communicators, as well as, again, the level of audience engagement on their posts, focusing on comments and conversations. The next thing I did was I completed interviews with each of the 7 communicators. And this was basically to determine why they're using particular social media strategies and maybe why they're avoiding others. Similarly, I completed an audience survey, and this was administered to social media users who were in conversations on the posts of the science communicators during the month that I collected data. And again, similarly, this was to figure out, why do people choose to participate in social media conversations with science communicators? And then finally, the last step, I did an audience biography analysis, and this was to figure out, are these science communicators reaching outside of the scientific community and therefore reaching a lay audience? And so I'm going to walk you through some of my results, and we'll kind of start in reverse. So the first thing I want to share with you is the engagement. So this is a figure of the number of conversationalists. And conversationalists here are social media users who were in conversations directly with the communicators on their posts during the month that I collected data. And so what you see on the bottom are the two communicator groups, the individuals and the organizations. And you're going to see two bars for each of the groups. One representing engagement on Instagram posts and one representing engagement on Twitter. And so there's two main things that I want you to take away from this figure. The first thing is that the individual communicators are receiving more engagement than the organizations. The second thing is that for all 7 of the communicators, there's more engagement happening on Instagram rather than Twitter. So we've kind of established what's happening with engagement. But remember, I was also concerned with who is interacting with the communicators on their posts. And so based on my audience biography analysis, I found that for the individual communicators, just over half of the conversationalists self-identified as scientists on social media. For the NGO communicators, less than 5% self-identified as scientists. And so in other words, the individuals are reaching a relatively diverse audience, kind of a mixture of scientific people and non-scientific people, whereas the NGOs are reaching a majority lay audience. But this basically answers kind of one of my earlier questions, in that overall, the communicators are reaching outside of the scientific community. But you're probably wondering at this point, why was there more engagement for the individuals as compared with the organizations? Well, when I integrated all that data together from those 4 steps, I basically found that there are interpersonal communication strategies, what I called interpersonal communication strategies, which were more effectively implemented by the individuals rather than the organizations. And this is leading to more engagement on their social media posts. So you might be wondering, what's an interpersonal communication strategy? Well, I'll start with one example, and then I'll kind of go through some other ones. And this first example is something that I'm sure everyone's aware of. When you hear the word social media, maybe some of you take these, maybe some of you make fun of people for taking these, and yes, I'm talking about selfies. So I actually found that selfies are an important interpersonal communication strategy, which can increase engagement on social media posts for science communicators. And so what I'm going to walk you through here is a similar figure as to what you've seen before, but this time representing the percentage of posts that contains selfies for each of the communicators. And this time you're only going to see 1 bar for each communicator, and it's going to be split up into 3 colors. We have Instagram posts and Twitter posts just as before, but also we'll see Instagram stories. And for those of you that don't know, Instagram stories are basically kind of informal Instagram posts that are only available for 24 hours and then they disappear. So focusing just on the height of the bars right now, ignoring the colors, basically what we see is that the individual communicators use selfies more frequently than the organizations. So about 1/3 of all of the social media posts from the individuals contain some sort of selfie. And then looking more closely at the colors, which show kind of the distribution of selfies across the platforms, we can see that for nearly all the communicators, most of the selfies are being posted on Instagram. And this includes both Instagram posts and Instagram stories. Okay, but why are these important? Why are these increasing engagement on social media posts? Well, if we go into the literature, we see that known communicators receive more engagement on their posts. And so in other words, when the individual communicators post selfies more frequently, they're making themselves better known to their audience. Their audience is more familiar with the communicator, and this encourages them to participate in conversations. And this showed up really nicely in my survey as well, as nearly half of the survey respondents who discussed why they choose to participate in conversations cited some sort of personal connection or familiarity to to the science communicator as why they choose to respond. And this was summed up really nicely by one of the survey participants who said, "I prefer to know the person I'm engaging with." So basically, by posting selfies and being a known communicator, the individuals are encouraging the lay audience to participate in conversation. And I actually found 6 total strategies, and I'll kind of whip through the rest of them, and we will go through them. So the first one, as I said, being a known communicator by posting selfies, and especially selfie videos, talking directly to the camera, and therefore directly to your audience. The next one I found that was really interesting was relatability. And this took the form of what I called off-topic posts. So the individual communicators frequently posted things that weren't directly related to science, or what they were mainly sharing as science. And this is interesting because in the literature we see that when people see posts that are more similar in content to their own, they're better able to relate to that content. And this kind of encourages them, again, to engage with what they're seeing. And so by posting more relatable information, people are more likely to jump into conversations. And again, this was summed up really nicely by one of the survey participants, who said, "It's interesting to read about a person who's going through the same things in life." So again, by making themselves more relatable, the individual communicators are encouraging these conversations to happen. Now the next 2 strategies were related to language. So the individual communicators used more positive words and more personal pronouns in their social media posts. So words like happy and excited, or I and we. And what this did was it kind of created a more conversational language in their posts, and again, encouraged people to respond because the communicators conveyed more authenticity. And again, summed up really nicely by one of the survey participants. And as you saw in my title, it feels like engaging with a friend. So when audience members see this conversational language, it encourages them to jump into conversations. The 5th strategy was really important and really interesting. So the individual communicators responded to more comments overall than the organizations, and they really did so to form relationships. And so during my communicator interviews, I asked basically how long are typical conversations on social media posts. And one of them came up with this really cool response, which was, conversations are ongoing. They're very ongoing. And so it turns out when the communicators respond to their audience comments, they can form relationships with their audience, and this encourages conversations to happen over time. And they're not just restricted to a single post, they're kind of more continuous. And then finally, some of you might be wondering earlier on, I kind of showed Instagram received more engagement than Twitter. I haven't really discussed that yet. Well, it turns out that Instagram grants certain affordances that basically allows communicators to better implement these previous 5 strategies. And again, going back to my survey, this turned out really nicely in one of the quotes from the respondents who said, "Instagram allows for easy and efficient communication with people, businesses, and organizations." And so, in other words, Instagram is really just thought of as a more conversational platform. And so people are more likely to communicate back to the science communicators. And so I kind of whipped through those, so let's go through kind of a summary slide. So we can kind of think of this as 2 communication pathways. So starting out with the social media communicator, if they use more formal strategies, or maybe what we think of as more traditional communication strategies, maybe they're not known to their audience, they're sharing strictly scientific information, which is not always relatable. They're mainly using negative emotions and impersonal pronouns, so it's not really conversational language. They're not necessarily responsive to comments, and they're really focused on Twitter. I found that this is more likely to lead to a sort of transmission pathway, where the information is pushed out from the communicator to the audience, but that's basically where it stops. Alternatively, if the communicator uses these interpersonal strategies, so being known by posting selfies, being relatable, using positive emotions and personal pronouns leading to conversational language, being quite responsive to comments, and again, focusing on Instagram, then the communicator can form a relationship with their audience, and this encourages the audience to communicate back to the communicator, leading to this 2-way sort of information loop. So this is our 2-way communication, which we know is effective for science communication. And so this led me to a few recommendations. So starting with organizations, it's basically to implement these interpersonal communication strategies wherever possible throughout their social media activity, but especially focusing on Instagram if they can. Now, in one sense, this was really great because based on my communicator interviews with the organizations, these are already quite consistent with their social media goals. They're already trying to do all of these things on social media. However, and this is really important, organizations, of course, are not individuals, and so they can't function the exact same way as individuals on social media. And so they might need to establish some sort of interpersonal communication guidelines. So for example, what's appropriate for an organization to share that's off topic. But I think the most exciting part of, or results of my study kind of go beyond organizations to science communicators in general. And so because these strategies are not necessarily related to what information is being shared, but rather how it's being shared, they can be implemented by all marine communicators and really science communicators in general. And of course, these strategies are not restricted to digital environments. Science communicators offline can use these as well as science communicators online. And that is all I have.
Excellent, and thank you to both our presenters for keeping to the time schedule and now allowing a lot of time for the two-way communication of questions. And I will just say from my own personal observations and use of social media that pictures of my puppy trump anything else I'm going to post about. So you can, maybe you don't have to throw a shark in there, but a puppy in there always gets lots of attention. So I'm going to throw things open to questions for either one of our.
Curtis.
Yes.
I'm just trying to gather my thoughts by actually looking at how Instagram is laid out. So when you were talking about conversations,
Yeah.
would that consist of like, so there, if there's the post, what would you define a conversation after that?
That's a great question. So for my study, I defined a conversation basically as, so if the communicator posted and someone responded, and then if that got a response. So basically, ignoring the initial post, it was a post and a response.
So it didn't have to be a conversation with the post, the
So
original post.
I did both. So I measured all conversations first. The figure I showed was directly with the original poster, the original communicator. And actually, I'm glad you brought that up because I saw something that was really interesting. When I compared those two figures, so basically total communication or total conversations versus conversations just with the communicator, I found that for the organizations, most of the conversations on their posts were with other people basically conversing amongst themselves. Whereas with the individuals, most of their conversations were directly with the communicator. So that was pretty interesting.
Sarah?
So Alex, the Faculty of Science is streaming things out of the Science 4 stream now, one of which of the streams is for communications and science. If you had a chance to be in the room with the coordinator, Allison, what would you say to her about the kinds of things needed to be included in the curriculum, say the third and fourth year level for those students?
So these are students who are going into at the undergraduate level?
It's the undergrad, yes.
Okay.
So it's kind of a biology major with maybe some J classes from King's, looking
Right.
towards being a science communicator, either as a journalist or doing promotions for a group like OTN.
Right. I guess one of the first things, as I mentioned in my presentation, a lot of science communication tends to be skills-based. So when we're thinking of, what are the training and things that people need to know, a lot of the time is like, what do you do in a hostile interview situation? How do you get your message across effectively? And like very basic things like how do you construct a lead to a story to draw people in and things like that, which are really important. But I guess one of the things that I wanted to emphasize is that a lot of the time what people don't think about with science communication as much is the theory. Why are we communicating science in the first place? And I'd like to emphasize that I don't believe that we should necessarily be concentrating on things like the message box. I think there should be more discussion about this is the role of a science journalist. This is the role of someone who communicates science. I guess like it is an ethical obligation as well as a job because of the important role that science is playing and continues to play.
Another question for Curtis. That was a really interesting job. I was just wondering, I kind of thought about it when you were discussing the different individual organizations. Did you come across if any of the accounts were private or public? Like, would that play a role in the conversation?
That's a good question. So basically the 7 communicators all had public accounts.
Yeah.
For the kind of other people in conversations, the survey went out to people, and I think I was actually kind of surprised how few private accounts there were.
Okay.
I don't have a number or anything, but it wasn't something I was necessarily focused on. But it's definitely something to be concerned with.
Yeah, just to think about how conversations can.
Yeah, an interesting tidbit that came out of one of the interviews with actually an organization. They said that they kind of saw this as well, and something I didn't get into here was direct messaging.
Okay.
So they saw that people are surprisingly comfortable sharing, I guess, or participating in conversations through direct messages. And I kind of asked why, and they said just sort of the nature of the platform. People just, I think the person said even people with private profiles still feel comfortable, and more comfortable in sharing in those conversations. So I thought it was pretty interesting. Yeah.
I've got a question I think can probably go to both of you, but possibly more towards you, Curtis, informed by Alex's presentation. So thinking of this like antagonism that Alex explored between the way that journalists present science communication objectively or with nuance. In your research, did you find, well, those social media as like a preferred tool for having two-way dialogue, that there was a loss of objectivity or nuance in the type of science that can be communicated?
That's a really good question. I definitely think that's a concern. It was definitely a concern for the organizations because, of course, they want to be, I guess, an authority for lack of a better word on what they're communicating about. It's not something I guess I can really get into too much because it's a really big question. But I think it's something that's really important to think about, and something I've added with definitely when writing is and preparing the recommendations. Because that's something organizations definitely need to be concerned with, and individual communicators as well. Is are you losing nuance by having these conversations? Are you losing a little bit of control over the message? So it's definitely something to be aware of. Yeah.
Just one thing to add
Yeah.
as well. I think we're both talking about it like, here's the best way to communicate science so that like society benefits the most. But of course, if you're if you're like working for an organization, your job isn't necessarily to maximize the benefits for society. It might be protect your organization's reputation at all costs. Some of these recommendations might be harder to implement than others.
Dan?
With that in mind, did you ask at all, or did you see what motivations were for making posts? Is an organization only posting because there's someone on staff whose job is to make a post as opposed to private individuals?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So actually a big section of my report was focused on the motivations because I was really interested in that. And there were some shared ones for sure, but there are definitely some differences. So for the organizations, the ones that come to mind are things like funding. So they actually kind of can increase the funding opportunities. Just getting their message out there kind of to a wide range of people was really important to them. Whereas for the individuals, especially, I guess it would depend who you talk to, of course, but the ones I talked to all had this common theme of talking about science in general, kind of like what is science, and kind of communicating that rather than just research. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Kind of that. Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, for Curtis. I feel like it might have been touched on with your question, but did you find that any of the conversations kind of led to the other end of the spectrum? So, like, for instance, if it was a more off-topic post, was there anything related to the research and science aspect that led into posts like people kind of going off topic, and vice versa with the science? Do you feel that sometimes people brought other elements that weren't really related into the conversations, and if so, how that was dealt with by the organization with your research?
That's a good question. So one thing I didn't do was I didn't look at it on a post-by-post basis as far as, I guess, how much engagement was on this post, what strategies did they use on this post. I more looked at it as kind of an overall picture. So based on kind of the survey and the interviews, it's kind of more of not thinking of it as a post-by-post basis, but more as an ongoing thing. So for example, a communicator might post something off topic, and that might spark a conversation that isn't related to science at all. But that connection's still been formed between the communicator and the audience member. So next time the communicator does post about science, maybe they're more likely to participate in that conversation. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
So Alex, with the discussion about the nuance and so you're talking a lot about the sort of ethical implications for journalists. How does social media fit into communication? So what is if you have, individuals who are becoming science communicators and they're, scientists for the most part who are using that platform, but maybe not considering those ethical implications, how do you deal with the issue of social media? Or is it an issue?
So like if a scientist is transitioning to becoming a science communicator, how should they be doing it ethically? Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that there's an answer for that. There's maybe a general set of guidelines that maybe Curtis can speak to, but I mean, I think the nature of social media is that it is constantly adapting and evolving, and the platforms have changed a lot even within the last 5 years. So I would be hesitant to say here is how a person should approach their role as a science communicator, especially online. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. I don't have an answer to it, but a couple of the individuals brought that up is they were concerned about it as well. So I know one in particular was brought up ethics of scientists communicating directly with the public. Also about communicating research that's not published yet. So if you're kind of doing it throughout your research, there's all of those things to think about definitely. So I think there's a lot more to it than obviously we're talking about today, and that's a major one is the ethical implications of any person or any researcher kind of being able to communicate with the public.
I have a question for both Alex and Curtis. Did you change your views about scientific communication in the process of conducting your study? Did you go in with one view and come out with another?
Good job. Dr. Good job.
I mean, yeah, I think for me, one thing that kind of, I don't know if this is the right way to say it, but my results in a way were almost kind of not obvious, but simple in a way. We kind of always talk about, when talking about researchers and decision makers interacting, building trust relationships and those taking time and all those sorts of things. And I kept coming up with the same, basically, a lot of similarities between kind of what we study is, or what I learned in my program is, this is what we should be doing when talking to decision makers, and kind of needing those same characteristics, as well as just the fact that people are social people, although social media is definitely its own kind of animal as far as how we interact with each other, I think at the end of the day, the way we interact face to face, we enjoy that, and kind of translating that to the digital environment can be helpful. So, yeah, I don't know. I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think I probably knew intuitively to a certain extent that the end of the research would be like, you need to develop these relationships, you need to build trust. But of course, I think scientists and journalists, and this came up during some of my interviews as well, actually are similar in some respects, in that they both really like knowing a lot of things and telling other people what to believe. So that was probably difficult for me to personally get over.
Oh yes, go ahead.
It seems to me that the objective, if you are trying to transmit information about science, is to get to as large an audience as possible. And that in Canada might be CBC Radio or NPR in the States, or it may be giving a TED Talk. So do you think your strategy is going to get you an invitation to give a TED Talk or a CBC Ideas program? And more importantly, do you think you'll get invited back?
Good question. I think that what this, or at least what my research suggested, is that although a program like CBC Ideas or NPR or TED Talks might be a very effective way of reaching a lot of people at once, it isn't necessarily a good way of changing people's minds about science. And in particular, if you're trying to rebuild some of the trust that I think has been lost between science and the public, the sorts of strategies that we've been discussing today about developing these sorts of methods and avenues for two-way communication are important. That being said, like a program like Quirks and Quarks or CBC Ideas isn't going away. It's going to remain. People are still interested in science, and especially things like new discoveries. But I think what at least our research seems to emphasize is that if we're hoping to change people's minds on some of the larger issues that people have kind of set up walls about, so things like climate change, the giving of more facts, the giving of more information, the person on a stage talking to people isn't necessarily the most effective model to do that.
Yeah, no, you said it really well.
So you're putting a lot of faith in social media. And do you not think that what happened in the US election and is continuing to happen in the United States vis-a-vis certainly Facebook, and I'm willing to bet the other two medias on Twitter, I think the president's done a good job, but your dependence on Instagram, do you really think the public has the faith in those, or are they just blinded and they're going to trust everything that you say on Instagram or Facebook?
That's a really good point. I think an important point, and kind of circling back to what you said a little bit, is I want to be careful in saying I don't think this is the only way we should be communicating is on social media. I think all of those programs you mentioned are important as well. But as far as kind of being careful about what information is being shared, something I've been kind of thinking about in terms of my research is you can go on the internet and you can find information back up any view that anyone has. The information is there. I think the point of using social media in this more personal way is to basically rebuild trust that has been lost. And so by starting out with these relationships between communicators and the public, hopefully you can convey that authenticity and show them that you are sharing kind of things that connect with them on a more personal level. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you very much. Any final words? I was going to ask you to just kind of reflect back to your management problems, that you started with. And in terms of thinking about sort of changes in scholarly communication and the need for citizens to be more engaged, any final thoughts on that and how things are going to evolve over the next little while?
I don't know. I mean, something that keeps coming up in my mind is as much as it's important for citizens to be engaged, I also think as science communicators and researchers, we need to challenge ourselves to be thinking about this more often. And I think it's very easy in research to find a result and try to move on to the next thing. But especially when it comes to communications, I think we need to be realizing in a lot of ways, and again, there's a lot of people doing great work, but in a lot of ways we're struggling, and we need to start implementing or trying new things.
And I think there was, that article that was talking about the very discouraging uptake of most academic research papers. So when you compare the fact that you might, spend a lot of time on a research paper that very few are going to read, do you see, this as a way forward is trying to bring research to more?
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's something we need to be thinking about and I don't want to get too into the weeds of how researchers are encouraged to write papers and all that sort of thing, but I think that's an important question.
Yeah.
Is we spend so much time creating these research outputs, and no one, at least for the most part, no one from the public is going to read that. And if they did, it might not be super useful for them. So how can we basically transition that, or maybe in addition to that, have some outputs that are more useful for the public?
I think also just the issue of engagement more generally. There is like this big emphasis now on how do we engage people. Like we need more people engaged. But of course, like just simply holding, if you've ever been to like a Halifax like planning meeting or something, the people who show up to those sorts of things aren't necessarily the people you need to have in the room. So I think we need to be careful also about how we're measuring engagement. Like simply holding a public session in which people are invited to comment on a particular thing isn't necessarily engagement.
No,
although it's often written down as such when it comes time to report, how many people did you consult on the project? So.
Excellent. Any last thoughts from Dr. McDonald?
Not at the moment, no.
Excellent.
You
have
lots of thoughts that are not last.
Okay, excellent. Well, on behalf of the school, I'd like to thank both of you.
Thank you very much.
For
Thank you
this
so much.
excellent talks and conversation, and we will definitely, I'm sure, the class will continue to discuss many of these ideas. So thank you very much. And before I let everyone go, I thought I'd just do a couple of plugs for other opportunities to engage with the School of Information Management. So our students are holding their Information Without Borders conference next Tuesday, which is February 12th. And the theme this year is about accessing information. And this is a very broad topic which relates to all kinds of different themes and accesses relating to that. I'm also very excited to announce that Camille Calisson, who's one of the leading Indigenous librarians in Canada, she was part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and is working on numerous different committees at the Canadian and international level about traditional knowledge and how we can really move towards more access to this. So Camille will be here on Thursday. She's actually going to be here Thursday, February 28th and 29th. So we're going to be organizing both smaller meetings and larger meetings. But we are going to be having our Horrocks lecture on Thursday, February 28th from 5:30 to 7:30. So you'll be receiving more press releases about that. We are also hosting an open data contest. So for all of you who want to know how to change things by engaging with data and creating apps that people can use, that's going to be going on here on March 1st and 2nd. And finally, Dr. McDonald is also bringing us another excellent lecturer. So Dr. Goran Prout from Belgium will be here talking about fonts of knowledge, transitions in the design of early modern books in the Netherlands. So he is going to be here on Friday, March the 8th at 3:30. And all of this information is on our website, so I encourage you to pay attention.
Okay, so one last thought before everyone leaves the room. There is another lecture which I'm hoping the speaker has arrived next door for those of you who are getting a 2-for-1 tonight. But her flight out of Ottawa yesterday was cancelled. She was supposed to be at the airport at 5:30, so tonight, so hopefully she's arrived. So that lecture is definitely next door. So please go next door. Those of you who are interested, and I can see Ian is...
We have an emergency because we can't get the system to work, and we're hoping one of you
Well, we'll come there in just a second. The students who are in the class, which is part of this lecture here tonight, please stay for a few minutes because we have a photographer who might get a group photo. So thank you to everyone else who came. This is all part of a very interesting course on information and public policy and decision making, and we appreciate both Alex and Curtis contributing to the course as well as to your information here tonight. Okay, thank you.